If you love liberty, declare your independence by signing the Shire Society Declaration at shiresociety.com.
Okay, it's 5, I can tell it's 10 o'clock. I'll open the hearing on House Bill 1431, prohibiting the state and political subdivisions from acquiring military equipped vehicles or equipment which are not readily available in an open national commercial market. Is members of this committee that were here last year remember? What was it, the year before? The year before, we had this bill before us. We sent it to interim study and we neglected the bill and the sponsor by not doing anything with it. And if I had had knowledge of that, I would have done something different. But I'll recognize Representative Hole, who's the sponsor of the bill. Ask for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Representative Hole, serving the towns of Bow and Dunbarton. I think I've been before this committee at least once or twice, maybe 3 times before on this bill. Okay, I'm here to introduce and ask that you pass HB 1431. This goes back to, let's take a step back in history to the 2013 timeframe, when 1,500 residents in Concord signed a petition saying we don't want Concord to have a Bearcat. The leadership of the town, I don't know whether they're aldermen or selectmen in Concord, doesn't matter, went ahead and approved it anyway because they got this $250,000 really cool vehicle that costs a lot to maintain, okay, because it's not built on commercially readily available parts. These are military equipment. The room at the upstairs of, right over here in fact, at the police station, which is their large hearing room, was filled with protesters opposing this. But they went ahead and did it anyway. That bill has come before this House and this committee several times since then. As the chairman just mentioned, the last time it came before this House, there was supposed to be an interim study, and it was supposed to be a study, and this committee was supposed to look into the issues associated with having military level equipment. And what we're talking about is not just, oh, an extra firearm here, or pharmaceutical drugs, or blankets. Those aren't the things we're talking about. We're talking about equipment whose sole purpose is used to extinguish life, okay? Be those grenade launchers in the town of, or in the county of Belknap, which have since been returned. But why did they need grenade launchers sent to a local police department? As I said, the bill has come numerous times before. We've made tweaks to the language over the years. Bottom line is, it's very narrowly defined to military equipment only. It doesn't talk about pharmaceuticals. If the government wants to give away penicillin, great. I'm sure we have lots of county and towns that would love to have extra penicillin laying around. If it's blankets, same thing. Okay, generators, same thing. That's not what we're targeting, no pun intended. What we're talking about here, okay, is excess military equipment like assault rifles, quote unquote, Bearcats, armored personnel carriers. The first time this bill came out, there was a huge uproar about it. It actually made the Wall Street Journal, page 2. We did a little bit of research. Although it's not in New Hampshire, the town of Queensbury, New York, a town of about 18,000 people or so, okay, got an armored personnel carrier that was so big it couldn't drive over some of the bridges in the town. Was that really necessary? It was a $500,000 plus piece of excess military equipment. So what we have is something that was reauthorized again this past August, hence the bill coming up again. For a while the program was put on hold. It's time to say no more. Well, someone argued that this is a local control issue. Let the towns decide whether they want this. Well, we've seen what happens. It's a good argument, in fact, in favor of not supporting this bill. However, what we've seen is some people are brainwashed by the dollar signs of this really cool vehicle that we can use to put out forest fires, hypothetically, or something else. And they go ahead and they accept it, not realizing the incurred cost long term to owning that type of vehicle. Again, all the parts go through the military channel, so they're more expensive. We've heard the proverbial $100 or $600 hammer, because there's an exclusive list of people who can produce these parts that are authorized to make those level components. I would ask that you would find this bill ought to pass, so that we can send this over to the Senate and actually get something done instead of just studying it, as we attempted last time and did not happen. And with that, I'll close my testimony.
Questions? Representative McCarthy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you ever been a police officer?
I have not.
Have you ever been shot at in the military?
I have not.
No more questions.
Representative DeSimone?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Do you know what the cost is for the local police departments to call out the local National Guard for the use of one of these pieces of equipment?
I don't have those numbers. We could probably get someone in research to find out what it costs to bring out the National Guard. I do know, and Berwyn Heights, Maryland, not applicable to New Hampshire, but the story is relevant, okay? They were doing a SWAT raid because they suspected the person receiving this package was being the recipient of drugs. What they didn't realize, it was actually the FedEx driver who was going to deliver the package and then pick it up and take it on his merry way and sell it. But the reality is, the SWAT team had the wrong house, and they trampled over the mayor and his mom and shot their dogs, and it cost the town lots of money in a lawsuit that they lost because they brought in a SWAT team. I'm not always sure bringing in the SWAT team is the appropriate thing. There are standoff situations. Those are few and far between, okay? And there's been a couple in the state. I'm not saying it's zero. It's few and far between. But what is the cost to maintain this vehicle every year, to give it its own? They don't go out, they're not parked out in the parking lot. They're parked in a special heated garage somewhere. That cost is incurred whether you use it or not.
I'm not talking about a SWAT team. I'm talking about a situation that we may need this vehicle. So we would contact the local National Guard. I'm just wondering what the cost would be to contact the National Guard to bring out the vehicle, and what the cost would be to purchase the vehicle. My guess is that it would be less expensive to contact the National Guard than it would be to purchase the vehicle and maintain it.
So, thank you. It's a great question. The cost is effectively zero to purchase because these are being effectively excess military equipment that's supplied free of charge, provided you maintain it and don't sell it. There's a bunch of contractual obligations. Those costs are about the building you have to store it in, and if it breaks, the repair of those. I don't know what that ongoing maintenance costs are. I know these are not like buying, you could go out and buy an F-150 or another pickup from another Chevy pickup, doesn't matter what brand, okay? And have a vehicle that probably has most of the capabilities that is a lot lower in cost to maintain than what we're talking about. If the National Guard is called out, like it was when the western side of the state saw massive flooding, these aren't the vehicles you may need anyway. You may need a bulldozer or an excavator that day. I don't know that you need effectively a Humvee.
Thank you.
Representative McCarthy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way the bill reads, it says it prohibits the state and any political subdivision of the state. That includes the National Guard to the state of New Hampshire. So if the Army has excess tanks, excess Humvees, excess whatever, they can't take them because they got to go to somebody who manufactures them.
Thank you. That is exactly how the text is written. If we want to modify it such that the National Guard is exempted, I'm okay. At some level, that's different than having a local police department do this. The state also includes the state police, right? Fish and Game. I'm not sure Fish and Game needs a Humvee. So yes, the state as drafted right now is inclusive of all agencies. The National Guard could be something that, if you guys want to amend the bill, there may be value. They already have that type of equipment because that's part of their job. I can take one more. I have a 10-15.
Okay, this bill also says that any equipment, if this passes, that is currently in possession has to be
Forfeited.
turned in, so therefore that would apply to the National Guard.
As written, yes.
Okay, and the last time the bill was before us, we had spoken about regional areas that could have some of this equipment, like a Nashua team could have it for the national area in Manchester and Laconia, and not every department. That hasn't come into play.
I think this bill is verbatim. I'd have to go back and check with the last time, before we actually started, the committee started looking at possible amendments. I did not adopt the amendments that we had at that time. I adopted the bill as filed last time.
All right, any other questions?
I know we've talked a lot about vehicles, but also in this bill is military grade hardware, Title II weapons, whatever that is. So could you talk to us about the items that you find to be in current use in towns and counties and other state agencies that would be impacted by this bill?
Okay.
In terms of hardware, non-vehicular items that this bill would
Sure.
impact.
So when you talk about civilians owning full auto machine guns, they're called Class 3 firearms. Okay, that's just the title. I bought an NFA compliant firearm. I bought a Uzi. I bought a machine gun. Whatever. Technically, when a political department, sorry, a state department or a county in this case, or a police department buys it, it would fall under what is actually a second paragraph of that statute under the NFA Act, and it would be considered a Title II weapon. So this is anything that is either select fire or full auto. This is a belt-fed machine gun. I don't know that we need our police departments having belt-fed machine guns. I don't know of any belt-fed machine guns, but I do know that there was some select fire rifles that came in. There was a list of all the hardware that had been delivered to the state back in 2013. I can go back in my notes and see if I can find that list, but it was rather extensive, to the tune of north of $4 million worth of types of hardware. Okay, most of that was vehicle. There was a couple of really expensive, like an infrared camera type thing, or some optical sensor thing that was sent in. I don't know that we need select fire rifles with our police departments. And, right, select fire are 3-round burst firearms. If there's standoffs at that level, something has gone really awry along the way. And I'm just concerned. We end up with police, instead of wearing blue uniforms, running in the door, breaking down the door, wearing black uniforms late at night, and it escalates. And I just don't want to see the civilians on the far side of that. I would love to answer more questions. Unfortunately, I have a 10:15 bill introduction. Thank you for your time. If there's any questions, have the chairman or somebody get a hold of me, and I can work with the committee.
I'll get a hold of you about it.
Okay, thank you.
I'll recognize Representative Wallace, Rockham 33, in support of the bill. It's 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm co-sponsor. For the record, my name is Representative Scott Wallace, and I represent the towns of Brentwood, Danville, and Fremont. Incidentally, one of my businesses, I trade in military surplus vehicles, trailers, generators, and things like that. And one of the routine processes that one has to go through, without exception, to acquire this type of equipment is a lengthy background check conducted by the Department of Defense. Each and every time equipment like this is acquired, whether it's as simple as a cargo trailer, a generator, an MRAP, Humvee parts, etc., and you enter into a very specific contract with the Department of Defense that you will not sell it, transfer it out of this country without prior written consent of the Department of Defense. That being said, access to this type of equipment is controlled highly at the federal level, much like NFA items, as Representative Hall mentioned. That being said, there is certainly opportunities for people that may not pass this type of a background check to be in control of this type of equipment. So that's a concern for one on the vehicle side. As far as Title II weapons, once again, NFA requirements require, in order to receive a Class 2 or 3 weapon, fingerprints, FBI background check each and every time an individual component or firearm or destructive device or AOW, any other weapon is acquired. By these being granted to the political subdivisions, towns, counties, etc., those processes are sidestepped. For example, I don't know if anybody has NFA items or if you have an NFA trust, which is put together to hold these types of items. But even if you're a named member of that trust under current federal law, each and every time a piece is acquired, fingerprints, background checks are conducted each and every time for acquisition. Subsequent to approval, chief law enforcement officer in the town is given a list of the items that a particular trust or individual may have. So unless these types of protocols are put into place, we don't have equal protection under the law. Towns and counties are subject to all the rules and laws of the state, from my understanding, and that's part of the concern that I have. And with that, I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
Representative DeSimone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for taking the question. In layman's terms, what credentials must I have in order to purchase any of these items that you discuss?
You must have a squeaky clean record. That means no felony charges, no misdemeanor convictions on which you could be sentenced to more than a year and a day in jail. There has to be a legitimate purpose. You have to state in writing, in no uncertain terms, your intent of what you choose to do with this particular piece of equipment. And if the DOD doesn't see fit or doesn't approve that, you will be denied receipt of said product.
What would one of those legitimate intents be?
For its intended purposes, for one, for resale, for its intended purpose. For example, a generator, if you intend to use it for production of electricity, that would be approved. If you wanted to use it for parts, for example, to disassemble a unit to maintain another, that would be approved, providing the components do not leave the state or the United States without prior written consent of the Department of Defense. And that applies for something as simple as medications were mentioned previously. Surplus medications do require an EUC or an end user certificate granted by the DOD in Battle Creek, Michigan.
What about one of these belt weapons?
A belt-fed machine gun?
Yes. What would I need to prove to purchase one of those?
You would have to supply 2 sets of fingerprint cards to the FBI, BATFE Form. You'd need an approval from your CLEO, your Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the town in which you live, unless you have an NFA trust already set up prior to May of 2016, I believe. And that's a National Firearms Act trust. It is a trust, much like you'd have a family trust or an irrevocable trust for the purpose of holding NFA items, which would be selective fire or full automatic machine guns, destructive devices, grenade launchers, AOWs, for example, a briefcase gun, a pen gun. Those are considered any other weapon, and they are federally taxed and regulated.
John Brand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So from your testimony, it sounds as though what we're talking about here is NFA controlled items.
That's one aspect of the bill, correct.
All right. So could you explain to me what is in addition to who's this? What in addition to that is included in this bill, and how would you determine whether or not it was included or not included?
That's an excellent question, but as Representative Cole said, it probably doesn't make sense for local police departments to have weapon systems intended for military ops.
I'm sorry, but didn't answer my question. My question was, of the items that you say would not be controlled by the NFA, that would be included in and be affected by this bill, how will we tell which ones they are, and who is going to determine which ones fall under this bill and which ones don't?
Thank you for the question. Along those lines, I would suspect that items that would require a DOD, EUC, or Department of Defense end user certificate would be de facto items that this bill would apply to. If an EUC is not required, then any civilian could buy any or acquire any of that equipment without any hurdles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I did once own a government-issued truck to drive to the dump. That's the extent of my experience with these vehicles. But my question is this. From what I'm understanding from the conversation in your testimony, it seems like an individual could conceivably for whatever reason, decide that they need the vehicle, for example, the Bearcat, and this bill would not prevent the individual from buying it, but you think that the state agency, towns, states, they should not have it. Could you address that?
Yes, we have multiple levels of law enforcement, civil defense, and support in the state, and I think historically would find they're adequate. We haven't had any civil insurrection, as was posited as a reason for acquiring the Bearcat here in Concord. So things of that, we don't want to see the escalation and growth of the police state. You know, we're a civil society, and as such, keeping these types of items in the military, not in the civilian world, would lend to continue the civil society and promulgation thereof.
Well, just to follow up, I think my question was kind of a yes or no. So is it accurate to say that individual citizens could pass muster and get the vehicle, and the bill as written would not deny that? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Representative Pedro?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here this morning. Do you have any evidence that would tell us what type of this equipment already exists in the state?
No.
And where it is?
I do not, but I suspect that information would be readily attainable under a FOIA request for the DOD in Battle Creek, Michigan.
You're not aware of any
I couldn't tell you numbers,
automatic weapons or other than Bearcat?
Well, I'm sure we've all seen military vehicles on the road with plates or in people's yards or used in parades and whatnot. And as a member of a military vehicle club in the area, there are ample vehicles out there that I'm certain that most of the members would be certainly ready to use for purposes of civil defense on a voluntary basis that wouldn't cost the town, the state, any money in any way. And we work hard to maintain our vehicles in a level of readiness.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Oh, Senator Carson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question has to do with the very last sentence in the bill. It says any military equipped vehicle or military grade hardware acquired in violation thereof shall be forfeited. Is that imply that any equipment that required going forward, or this retroactively?
I believe that's going forward. The way I understand the bill is that equipment was acquired in contravention of the statute should it pass, that would be forwarded at that point.
So any political subdivision that had equipment now wouldn't forfeit that equipment?
That may be up to determination, that may be grandfathered.
And it doesn't say who it shall be forfeited to.
That is correct. It does not say that. I would suspect that it would go back to the agency from which it came.
I believe I asked the sponsor of the bill, if this bill passes, would the National Guard have to give up all the equipment that they have, and he said yes. Okay. So I think the intent is to get rid of all.
Everything is going on.
Yeah. So, Representative Tripp.
Thank you for letting me ask my question. Thank you for being here. I probably should ask this of Representative Hull, but since you're a co-sponsor, I hope I'll be able to answer it. Representative Hull had two basic concerns with this. The first was that the cost of maintenance of the equipment was something that the townspeople should have to bear through their tax rates. Correct. The second was that the equipment would be used for extra-legal events, like busting in houses and such as that. My question is, do you know what the cost would be?
I can't answer any specifics what the cost would be, but we did have a bill in committee earlier this year that had to do with the maintenance of the garage here in Concord, where Concord's Bearcat is kept. That vehicle is so laden with electronics and whatnot, it must be plugged in and heated all the time, or it will not start. So it's like having, it's much more maintenance intensive than a standard commercial vehicle. For example, there's a number of manufacturers of up-armored and SWAT-specific vehicles that are on General Motors vehicles, for example, the Suburbans, Excursions, things like that, that are that'll stop a 50 cal. And these things are perfectly suited for SWAT operations, protecting officers in a firefight. They're fully capable. I don't know if you've seen the video of what the president's motorcade tribal was in, but that's some pretty capable stuff, and it's not military. GE minigun pops out of the sunroof and 6,000 rounds a minute downrange.
Yeah. Having been in the service, it was always my opinion that the equipment was designed in order to operate from you know, very cold to very hot, and I find it surprising that Concord's Bearcat is kept in a climate-controlled environment, but that's not, has nothing to do with this.
You're right.
The other concern that Representative called was that the equipment would be used for extra legal events, such as breaking into drug houses or whatever. Do you have any memory of such events occurring in New Hampshire?
Not recently, but I will share a personal story. On April 19th, when Boston was under lockdown federally, I was on the way up here to testify on another matter at the LOB, and we had New Hampshire National Guard running down 93 and 101 eastbound, full battle rattle, 50 cals on the roof, locked and loaded, ready to go, soldiers at the ready with helmets on. So the National Guard certainly was able to deploy to help what was going on in Massachusetts. So I suspect we could respond rather rapidly to anything that might occur here in the state.
Well, much like Representative Brand, that's an excellent answer, but it wasn't to my question. Do you have any memory of instances in the state of New Hampshire where the political subdivisions have used military equipment that they've obtained?
No.
In these?
No. The SWAT team seemed to handle the Browns up in the North Country pretty well with the feds without any, so that would go to no need for this equipment.
All right, so it's, thank you.
Representative McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you believe that our military should be able to be backed up by any means, any weapon that science can think of to protect their lives?
Yes.
What makes it different than that our local and state police and our National Guard shouldn't have that same ability?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative McCarthy. I believe the posse comitatus prevents the U.S. military from taking any action on U.S. soil, correct?
I'm not talking about the U.S. military, I'm talking about the National Guard and local police.
Sure, but that was the premise of the question. The military, yes. The National Guard has the latest and greatest military equipment with already some restrictions. Are you aware that in New Hampshire, our Air National Guard does not have any gunships, nor have they for quite some time. They've been taken back by the U.S. military quite some time ago. So all the OH-58s that you see flying around and the Blackhawks do not have weapon systems on board, other than what the soldiers may carry themselves.
Do you know the reason for that? It's called sequestration, is it? From the prior administration that deleted the military budget?
We're getting off the subject matter. If you understand the intent of the bill, that's all we're really here for at this point, is to understand, not to prove the applicants are wrong. Thank you. Representative Danielsey from Fremont supports the bill, asks for less than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Representative Danitz. I represent Rockingham County District 10, the town of Fremont. I'd like to, I guess, comment on certain of the questions that I've heard and make some suggestions for amendment to the bill. Just as a prospective state guard, there is not one in existence right now, is exempted, I do believe the National Guard ought to be exempted. That said, having just sat down with the Adjutant General last week, it's my understanding that they don't really own any equipment. It all belongs to the federal government. It's just placed here. And they could continue to place things here without violating this statute because they're not purchasing equipment per se, at least for the large heavy grade equipment. I don't think this could go back and require towns to give up equipment because we are not allowed to, and nor do we make retrospective law. Having seen, my town has purchased a Humvee. It was actually a cast-off from another department. If they hadn't purchased it, it had to go back to the federal government. They were able to really get it on the double cheap. Having looked at it, I don't have any real heartburn about a Humvee. In fact, if you go back a decade, you could have gone down to a Humvee dealer and bought something relatively similar. The fact that this Humvee may or may not be up armor, that is, it's not going to suffer, it's protected from IED explosions. I don't have any heartburn. It's just a large four-wheel drive vehicle, and you probably wouldn't really want to ride it anyway. It's a bare bones vehicle. I would suggest that there probably ought to be some sort of tonnage or weight grade on it, so that, you know, yeah, they could be purchasing a Humvee without issue, but they probably ought to think twice about purchasing a Bearcat or an MRAP. I think probably rather than a strict prohibition, it probably ought to go before the voters of the town. It's their money, and it's their peace officers, and I prefer the term peace officers rather than law enforcement. It's a different connotation. We have to remember they are not military. They were never intended to be military. They are civilians just like everybody else pretty much in the state. But they are, like us, members of government. They are not members of the general public. And that is a significant distinction. As to why they ought to be armed differently, first of all, we do have the National Guard, potentially a state guard that could be armed adequately to take care of any enormous event. On the other hand, our police are dealing with Americans, our neighbors, our sons and daughters. And I think the way that we ought to be dealing with those individuals is different than we should be dealing with people attacking our troops in foreign places. I had one other thought, but I can't think of what it was, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
As a co-sponsor to the bill, it sounds like you don't agree with it as worded.
As written, I think that it deserves some work.
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. I'll call Stephen Sherman, Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Division of Forests and Lands, opposes the bill. Has written testimony. It would like 2 minutes.
How would you like these handed out? Just
could you just pass them around?
Yeah, top one's the original. Thank you, Chairperson Belanger and members of the committee for allowing me to testify. My name is Stephen Sherman. I'm the chief of the New Hampshire Forest Protection Bureau. The Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Division of Forests and Lands opposes this bill. The Division of Forests and Lands, we have 2 agreements in place with the U.S. Forest Service. Those agreements are for the acquisition of federal excess property for the purpose of firefighting. One is called the Federal Excess Personal Property, or FEPP program, and the other is the firefighter property, which is the FFP program. And the the U.S. Forest Service has that agreement with Department of Defense. For the distribution of this equipment, we work with the New Hampshire Association of Fire Chiefs, and they work with us. We review applications and distribute the equipment to communities based on need. Some of the equipment is excess military property. If you look on the back of the written testimony, you'll see pictures of 2 pieces of equipment which we have here in New Hampshire. You can see they are set up for firefighting, and that's how these programs work. The U.S. Forest Service comes in at least once every 5 years and does an audit on the program, where they go through our paperwork process and how we administer it, as well as go out and do physical inventories on the equipment to make sure that it is set up for firefighting purposes. As far as the equipment being available on the open market, or some of this equipment, we don't always know whether it would be or not, because the town isn't gaining ownership of it. We manage it, and when they're done with the equipment, with the FEPP program, it's turned back into the state, and if it doesn't go out to another community, then it goes back to the federal government. Currently, we have over 200 pieces of equipment that we manage with these 2 programs out to just under 70 communities, and the dollar value is $3.1 million. The towns get this equipment for free, and they get to use it. And the one thing with the military equipment is you take a Humvee or that other 2.5-ton truck that's pictured on the back. They're built very sturdy, and this equipment isn't on the road every day. It's used to go out into the woods, or maybe during a flood. So the maintenance isn't real high because they're not always on the road traveling, so you don't get that normal wear and tear that you think maybe with another vehicle. The 2.5-ton truck on the back, which is the larger truck, communities use those to create off-road tankers. They could put a 400-gallon tank on that and be able to get water out into the woods where normal vehicles couldn't make it as far. These programs are extremely important to the fire departments in New Hampshire for not just wildland fire, but response to natural disasters. And our department feels that the limitations set forward with this legislation would limit the availability, the types of equipment available to these fire departments. Thank you.
Questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. I'll recognize Captain William Haynes from
I'm your state
coordinator of LESO.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Captain Bill Haynes. Obviously, I'm with the Division of State Police, but I'm here today to speak on behalf as the state coordinator for the state of New Hampshire for the LESO 1033 program.
And is opposed to the bill?
I am opposed to the bill, and for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, the last time we spoke in 2013, I'd given you an update. I'd like to give you the most recent update. It'll take about 30 seconds. Just so you're aware, in the last 2 quarters, the fiscal quarter, federal fiscal year started in 1 October. In the last 2 quarters alone in the state of New Hampshire, we've requested 204 items for a total of $234,853 by the local municipalities that have gone into the local PDs. There are 81 police departments or law enforcement agencies that are currently associated with the New Hampshire program. There's a total value on the property book. This doesn't cover items that have come in that have since left the property book that don't have a demilitarization code do we have to count for, but currently on our property book is $5.5 million worth of equipment that has been brought into the state, and that's a rolling number based on what can leave the property book, what gets turned in, things of that nature. I've heard a lot of testimony about Bearcats, a lot of testimony about vehicles. I just want to share with the committee that there are a number of items that have been brought into this, and the majority of these are not. Only 16% of that inventory currently on hand is a vehicle or a weapon. The majority of that equipment are trunk lockers, they're underwater man cameras that the Marine Patrol picked up, they're light sets to utilize on rangers, they're D7 dozers that they needed to build town ranges with. They're command posts that are used by either sheriffs or other people, i.e. a tactical vehicle that has much more capability than anything that's made on the civilian market to get to areas or parts of our state that they need. It's a very intense program. Last year in May, we underwent our audit. We are required to be audited in the state every 2 years. Defense Logistic Agency, specifically the Law Enforcement Support Office, comes in and audits us. Last year in May, they picked 21 PDs at random. They came in here for 4 days. They required those police departments to lay out all of the accountable equipment, all of their paperwork. They checked all of the applications, all of the memorandums of understanding, and verified that our program was up to snuff. And I'm proud to say, as a state coordinator, the last 2 audits running, we've got nothing but accolades for how well we run our program. What is the program that you're talking about today? The program consists of myself, appointed by the governor to be the state coordinator. I have 3 state points of contact. All 3 of them are part of the Division of State Police. Each one of them has some military experience. One is a 6-year Marine. One is currently an active Lieutenant Colonel in the Army National Guard here in New Hampshire. He's got 20+ years. The other is a 6-year individual who's been with the state now 20 years as a soldier, and I, quite frankly, have 24 years of active duty service as an Army warrant officer, uniquely enough responsible for maintaining and taking care of weapons and automotive equipment. So that's the background of who your program consists of now. What's important? Here's what's important. Nothing that a local police department requests gets approved unless I see it. The justification has to be there, and it has to facilitate the need, an actual need based on the number of law enforcement officers provided. Even if I approve it, it then goes into the Battle Creek to where LISO has to approve it. If it doesn't meet any of those parameters, it does not get approved. So that's key to this program. We had a conference in August. Every year we have a conference where all members, contiguous United States and all of our territories meet. DLA puts that on. We talk about all of these issues. We had our conference in Norfolk in August, and why is that important today? Interestingly enough, that is when the executive order was reversed. We had just arrived on site in Norfolk when we all found out that President Obama's executive order had been reversed by President Trump. I will say this about that executive order. There are some things that are reversed, and we don't disagree with that. However, some of those items that were put in place as a result of the executive order, all of us at this conference agreed to that some of those items would stay in place. And why? Because they were just general good practices. And what are they? You must have a training plan before you can request a wheeled vehicle. You must fill out certain forms before you can request a tactical vehicle. You must demonstrate the ability to train and prove that they've been trained to operate that piece of equipment. You must do these for night vision devices, things of that nature. So all of those will remain in effect. So one of the questions was, as a result of the executive order, are we going backwards? I will say to you as a committee, absolutely not. Those items will come out in March in the revised Defense Logistics Agency's MOU, and I will in turn add those to our MOU, which would be required. Some of the things that I've done in addition over the last 3 years for accountability. Historically, after this conference, we actually sponsor a conference as part of the Department of Safety, and we invite all of the law enforcement agencies currently a member of the program who want to become a member of this program to come in, and we teach and train everything we know about this conference to include setting them up in an automated system. Last year, every year, from 1 October to 31 January the following year, these local agencies are required to certify and inventory all of their assigned equipment, and they're required to do that and certify through me. I am proud to say that this year, unlike most years in the past, by the 15th of December, all 81 agencies were certified in the state of New Hampshire. There were 29 agencies outside of us, other states and jurisdictions who had not. So we have a very good program. I will say this to you. In the past, we've invited people to training, and each year that we've given the training, we've had an increase in participation. My MOU that goes out this year will say, very simply state, if you do not make this training session, you will be suspended from this program, in order to make sure that everything we learn from this conference and everything we do will be passed on. So I just wanted you to be familiar with what your program in the state is, and let you know that the reason I'm opposed to this bill is it talks about military equipment. For those of us who've been around for a while, anything with a mil spec is military equipment. That's all the items that I just talked about, $234,000 of items that have been requested in the last 6 months that we wouldn't be able to get. Tourniquets, pouches to store equipment, trunk lockers, connexes that are sealed to store evidence in, things of these natures, armored safes, safes to store ammunition at ranges to protect the public so that if something were to happen, an explosion was to occur, that they're contained. These are items that the military had bought and provided and are now available to us as an agency. Those are the items I'm approving and seeing more often than not. We picked up a light tower to light up our night training up at the range in New Hampton. It's a military trailer mounted. It's definitely military equipment. It's got a 10 horsepower diesel generator attached to it. It provides power, provides lighting, and allows us to train. We couldn't have afforded that in our budget. We don't budget for those things. So I encourage you to consider this bill and know that, and I just want to address the Bearcat issue real quick. The Bearcat in Concord was not a military piece of equipment that was purchased through this program. There are items out there, MRAPs, that are available. The state of New Hampshire has not approved any MRAPs until recently. There was a request for one MRAP, and I just want to tell you, it was done through Rockingham County. There was an abnormal amount of paperwork and justifications this thick that has to go through that request to justify it, and it has to go all the way up through the governor's office to get approved. So we don't just arbitrarily, even though Rockingham County Sheriff wants an MRAP, they don't just go in here and order an MRAP. It isn't going to happen. And by the way, those are such familiar equipment, they're on waiting lists because they are mine-resistant, ambush-protected equipment. They're not combat vehicles. They're designed to protect the occupants in the vehicle. And furthermore, that particular piece of equipment will go places that most of us could never imagine that they would be able to go. And when you get out in the western terrains and up north into the troop battle, you see some of that terrain and some of that flooding that's gone on recently, it's easy to understand why that's an important piece for law enforcement to be able to address. Now, am I an MRAP fan? Do they cost money to maintain? Do they weigh 40 tons? Absolutely. But remember, part of the MOU is that the civilian governing board of this agency, i.e. the selectman, the town administrator, has to approve this. They have to sign off and verify that it's the current chief law enforcement agency and that they're willing and welcome to participate in it. If they sign up, and I've spoken to many select boards, I advise them, if you get this equipment, you need a budget line because it is going to cost you money to maintain it, and you need to be prepared for that. Mr. Chairman, pending any questions, that's my consensus. And you can get spare parts by requesting more than one piece of equipment. You're authorized one Humvee for every 4 people. If you want one specifically to use for parts to save money, you are allowed to request it specifically to utilize and cannibalize to repair parts in order to repair. It doesn't matter what type of vehicle it is. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
You said that you get applications for this equipment and you have to approve of it. When you approve of it, do you do that from a desk in an office or do you go visit the site?
There's 2 things that must occur. The applications come into me electronically. I have to verify, and as of recently, DL has required that your ORI, your identifying number, to identify you as a law enforcement agency. I have to verify that through NLETS to make sure that you have a valid ORI, that you are in fact a law enforcement agency. In addition, they have to give me individuals who are willing to authorize to screen. I have to verify that it's the current chief, that the chief that's there is really the chief. And then there's no on-site visits. I will say this, there are more security requirements for this equipment than we routinely have. For example, under the DLA program, you must have, in your cruiser, you must have 2 ways of locking it up, whereas some agencies have them just in a lock or just in the trunk. They don't accept that. It has to have 2 locking mechanisms.
There's no on-site visit and you don't have a face-to-face with the chief that's requesting the equipment?
I do not, but I see them annually anyway.
All right, on your training, you said that you're putting in a new program, and if you don't attend the training, you're out of the program. Or some words to that effect. When somebody attends the training and they get into the program, is that the community that gets into the program or the individual?
It's only, if the individual is appointed or put on the application by the chief and authorized by the chief of police in the civilian governing board. That's who usually attends the training, and or the chief in many cases. A lot of our chiefs show up at the training.
What I'm getting at is if that person that's attended the training and they're qualified, they no longer live in the community or they went somewhere else, is the community still authorized to participate?
They have to submit a new application.
So, and somebody else has to go for the training?
Somebody else has to go for the training.
Thank you. I see no representative. Volia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. Great testimony. There are several people that introduced this bill. Did any of the representatives or senators, sponsors contact you or have a discussion about this bill prior to today?
No representative.
Seeing no Representative Matthews.
Thank you. Just one question. Could you give the full name of the program, please?
It's referred to as, the official name is the 1033 program.
I'm sorry?
1033, it's a law that authorizes it. What you hear it referred to most is LESO. and you'll hear LISO program. That's the Law Enforcement Support Office. It's really not a program. That's the office that administers the 1033 program.
Thank you very much for your testimony, appreciate it. I'll recognize Chief Bob Cormier from Tilton, represent the Chiefs Association, is opposed to the bill. Ask for 5 to 10 minutes.
Or less.
To speak. My grandmother was a Cormier, but I don't think we were related.
Good morning, everybody. I did speak on this bill 2 years ago, and I represent the Chiefs Association. And part of for being here this morning is also, besides being here in opposition to the bill, to just help answer any questions you might have relative to this equipment, how we use it, any law enforcement related questions. Hopefully I can answer them for you. Some of my roles over the last few years, I've sat on the Homeland Security Grant Committee, so I was involved in the process when departments or regional teams purchase like Bearcat equipment. And so we put a lot of thought into what we needed across the state to protect ourselves for various incidents, whether it be a hostage situation, an active shooter, or a situation where we needed to rescue people under gunfire. I was also involved in a committee through Police Standards and Training that reviewed and came up with standardized policies and procedures for all the teams around the state. That was a year-long process. And I also sat on the Greenland Commission, where we spent a year reviewing the shooting in Greenland and the death of Chief Michael Maloney. And so, and then most recently, I worked on a committee that put together the warm zone protocols for the state, and I worked with the Fire Chiefs Association and the Department of Homeland Security on if there was a situation like, the music festival shooting in Las Vegas, or the nightclub shooting in Orlando, or some of the other situations where there was active shootings and still people needing to be rescued. How would we in New Hampshire respond to those? So each year I meet with the Fire Academy, I meet with the Department of Homeland Security for the state, and we try to come up with what's the best practices. And the vehicles that we have become an intricate part of that in how we do business safely for everybody, for the officers, for civilians that we might need to rescue, and for the safety of the suspects at times. We don't want officers going into houses, whether it's a barricaded gunman or high-risk warrant for drugs. That's the last thing we want to do, because it's the most dangerous for the suspects, the officers, for everybody involved. So our training has evolved over the years, where we're trying to look at alternatives to going in. Part of those alternatives involve the vehicles we use. If we can give the officers a safe place to negotiate the suspects out of the house, that's always going to be safer for us and for them. I can give you a situation where we had an armed home invasion in Concord a few years ago, where we had to negotiate the suspects out of a house in Pembroke. Training's evolved. 10 years ago, the officers would have went into that house to try to get the suspects. Now, from a safe position behind a vehicle like that, we call them out. Looking at the Greenland situation, we had officers that were shot and pinned down behind a vehicle that was a civilian vehicle that wasn't bullet protected, and they were pinned down there for several minutes, bleeding out. Those are the type of situations that we train officers to bring in vehicles like that to rescue them. They did use a vehicle to pull the chief out of there. Unfortunately, he was already deceased. And then the situation we had in Brentwood, where we knew that there was an officer in that house, and we had to get up there safely. We don't know, we don't have all the information that we might have on Monday morning, 2 days later when we get there. We don't know how many shooters there are, we don't know what they have for weapons. All we know is we have to rescue people, we have to rescue officers. And these vehicles have become an incredibly important piece of that. And they used one in Brentwood, and it was, as soon as they got the officer out of there, the house exploded. So we don't want to go backwards, because we've lost many officers over the years in the line of duty, not having the right equipment, not having the right training. And we really take pride in our training, in our equipment, and how we use it. And I can say that in New Hampshire, we have a great reputation of being a well-trained state of law enforcement. We do a great job. I don't think anyone can give an example of where we've misuse this stuff. But certainly we want to be prepared that if we have something like what happened in Las Vegas or in a school shooting, that we have the right equipment for the officers to go home at the end of the day and to rescue people, because we actually care more about rescuing people than ourselves. And that's the nature of our job. And you know, I've been in situations in my career where I was under gunfire. I've been in situations where I had to rescue people under gunfire. And we've come a long way, and we're doing business a lot safer now. So with that, I'd just take any questions you have.
Representative Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Question. Does the police chiefs or within the state, are there guidelines for the use of the equipment or to avoid the misuse of the equipment?
Absolutely. So the equipment comes under the use of the teams or the auspices of the teams, and the teams themselves come out under guidelines. So the use of a team or actually requesting a team is considered a use of force. So that the bar or the threshold to even request one is much higher now. So let's just say in the case of a warrant, there's a risk assessment that has to be filled out by the police department before they can even be requested. Looking past that, any time that there's, you know, an armed gunman or the possibility of a hostage situation, and sometimes the information we get is bits and pieces. We're not sure if it's a barricade gunman. Does he have his wife and kids hostage or not? We're trying to get that information en route to the call. But there is a high criteria for us to be activated, or for those teams to be activated. And so before those vehicles would be deployed, they would be deployed under those guidelines.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Appreciate it. I'll call Ian Freeman from Keene, the Police Department. He supports the bill. Asked for 3 minutes. Representative Meter, he is the last speaker.
Hi, I'm Ian Freeman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the New Hampshire Liberty Party. I do support this bill, and I was involved heavily in Keene when, back in 2011, I think it was, there was the proposal to receive a Bearcat, and I was on the streets talking to people, getting petition signatures, helping with getting hundreds of petition signatures in that case, from the people of Keene who overwhelmingly opposed the Bearcat. And when I say overwhelmingly, the time when I was actually in the city council chambers when they heard this proposal was the only time I've ever seen a full packed house at a city council meeting. I'm sure some of you have been to city council meetings before. You know that in many cases it's a pretty sparse turnout for those things. Usually it's the people who are asking for a favor that show up to these council meetings. In this case, it was so packed they actually had to have the fire department and the police downstairs to prevent more people from coming up because they'd hit the fire code limit. So as one person would come down, they would then allow another person to go up into the room. So that's how busy it was. And one of the city councilors at the time had reported back that the responses they had been getting, the inquiries, the opinions they'd been receiving from the people of Keene across the board, you know, regardless of Republican, Democrat, no party, whatever, it was 80 to 90% were against the Bearcat. So the people of Keene were firmly against it. They showed up in large numbers to oppose it at the actual meeting. They called, they wrote, they emailed, they let these councilors know we don't want our police to be militarized. It's not to say they don't want the police to be protected, because again, you can get protection, you can get body armor, you can get armored vehicles without having to go through militarized equipment suppliers. And regardless of all the opposition, they went ahead and voted for it anyway, because that's what the police wanted them to do. So they didn't really care. The city councilors didn't care what the people wanted. They just went ahead with whatever the police wanted. That was just so disappointing to see that happen. And of course it happened in Concord and in other places after that. So it's pretty clear that regardless of one's political viewpoint here in New Hampshire, people in New Hampshire are opposed to police militarization. And I think that's because the militarization of the police drives a wedge between the community and the people that those police are supposed to be serving, you know, ostensibly. When you you know, you give the police black uniforms, you give them dark sunglasses, you give them, you know, intimidating dogs, you give them, you know, militaristic vehicles. You're putting a wedge between this sort of idea of the peace officer, which we heard earlier with one of the state representatives testifying, having the idea of a peace officer whose job it is to maintain the peace, versus this sort of law enforcement officer who, you know, doesn't think, who doesn't look at the individual circumstances, who just blindly enforces laws. I like the idea of having a peace officer who's there to remedy situations and make things good in the community. And I think the more militarized the police force is, the more disconnected they are fundamentally from the very people that they serve. So I support this bill. I think it's a good step in the right direction. I would like to see the existing Bearcats being sent back to Lenco, which is the manufacturer down in Massachusetts. So I realize there's some uncertainty about that in this bill. And just as a couple other points to what a couple of the state reps said, I heard one state rep, I think it was Representative Matthews, say that that individuals can buy Bearcats. I don't believe that is the case. I believe that Lenco sells exclusively to police departments that have government funding. So meaning from the federal government, they received $300,000 or $280,000 in Keene, and they get to
You made your point, go ahead.
and then finally, Representative Belanger, I'm not sure if I wasn't clear. You said the National Guard would have to give up their equipment under this?
That's what I asked the sponsor of the bill, and he said yes.
Okay. That's all I had to say, and I appreciate you listening.
Representative Matthews.
Yes, just one quick question. I gather from your testimony that the protest of the people in Keene had to do with how the police look when they're in their, you mentioned their black uniforms, their dogs, that there's some sort of, you know, a problem with having them look a certain way. Could you just tweak that a bit and address that?
Sure. I think that attitude is important, right? So if you're coming to a job with the attitude of, it's my job to serve and protect, versus it's my job to arm up with as much military equipment and be as badass as I can be, I mean, those are two different mindsets, right?
Okay, so you, pardon me.
Yeah.
So you are assuming that the appearance of the police has to do with their attitude?
I think that both of those things sort of play off of one another. I mean, if you dress like a tough guy, you probably want people to think you're a tough guy. Whether you are or not is another question.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Goff here, make it quick.
Yeah, I will. So, does the police in the city of Keene, do they dress up like that every day to patrol the streets?
I was talking generally about this sort of shift that we've seen, not necessarily in Keene specifically for their type of dress, but police departments over time have moved from, you know, a more lighter colored uniform to darker colored uniforms in some departments. I'm not saying that's true of all departments everywhere. And I just think that there is something to that. There's something to the attitude that those colors and those tools can lead somebody to think about other people.
Thank you for your testimony. We have Jane Huska from ACLU who is in favor. Dan McGuire from Epsom, New Hampshire Liberty Alliance is in favor. Timothy Fortier from New Hampshire Municipal Association is opposed. Keith Ammon from Hillsborough District 40 is in favor. Representative Hull obviously is in favor, he's a sponsor. Representative Dick Hinch from the House Majority Office is opposed. Representative Scott Wallace, co-sponsor, is in favor. Representative Linda Gould from Bedford is in favor. Kevin Grady from Hooksett, SVAC, has no opinion. Daryl Perry, Liberty Lobby LLC, is in favor. Representative Barbara Finney from Rochester is in favor. Arnie Alps, ALP, something or other. Alpert, AFSC is in favor, and Representative Mark Prue, Hillsborough 44, is opposed. That will close the hearing on House Bill 1431.
We'd like to invite you to visit freekeene.com. FreeKeen.com features audio, video, and blogs chronicling the transition to a voluntary society. FreeKeen.com also has comments and discussion forums so you can be heard. FreeKeen.com.
I should be in Keene, New Hampshire with the Free Staters.